on a racing line where accuracy means being within inches, not within feet. My name is Marziali. I think some of you know me, but from very different angles, I suspect. So I'll give a bit of an introduction. I am the director of UBC Engineering Physics here, and I see some of my students in the audience. Thank you for coming. So I teach robotics, I teach some technical communications within that program. I run a small biotech company, and to some of you, I'm hopefully known as the guy that took Campbell Carlisle's SB4 record away at Autox. Still hanging on to it for now. As a continued introduction, on the car side, I won't go into the academic side, this is my car. This is one of my cars. It's the race car. It's a 99 M3. It's been supercharged, and with reckless use of an angle grinder, I've removed about 1,000 pounds from the car, chopped off the roof, rebuilt it in carbon. About half the outside is carbon. 410 horsepower last year at Autox with the supercharger, hopefully more this year. The kind of racing I do is entirely solo racing. There's Solo 1, Solo 2, the racers in the audience will know. Knox Mountain, for those of you that don't know, is a hill climb. Basically going up a mountain road as fast as you possibly can. Speeds are up to about 180 kilometers an hour, and here accuracy is critical because, as you can see, there's cliffs, there's trees, and cement barriers, which I've become intimate with. I also occasionally get to drive cars like this. I have a very nice and wealthy friend in Switzerland who, I don't know how that happened. Anyways, he owns a garage full of Ferraris, including 3 challenge cars, a 430, 458, and he just acquired this 488 challenge. He's been inviting me out to tracks in Italy to race these cars, again in time attack events where you're going for the fastest time around the track. Much less dangerous, weirdly, except for the possibility of me owing him $500,000. But substantially higher speeds, and it's given me the chance to experience cars designed by a real race manufacturer and tuned by Ferrari mechanics at the track. So getting a sense really of what a car should handle like. And being able to reach speeds, this track typically 250 kilometers an hour. Into turns that are down in this sort of 60, 90 kilometer an hour range. Now, what I spend most of my time doing, as many of you in the audience here that race, is autocross, also solo racing. I started racing about 12 years ago with the UBC Sports Car Club. Phenomenal experience, life-changing for me. It's been a fantastic hobby. And it was a very easy way to get into racing. Events are not terribly expensive, an incredibly friendly crowd, and obviously the people that put on tonight's event. The cars that race there were, the silver car was the previous version of the black car before the angle grinder incident. The red car is my daily driver. And then there's Steph's Honda S2000, which is a lovely car, and my daughter's Mazda Miata, a recent addition to the stable. So I've been autocrossing these cars. Autocross, again, for those of you that don't know, is a large, very large parking lot, effectively, filled with cones, where you have to take a certain line through the cones that's written out on a map, and again, do that as fast as you possibly can. This is quite an old video, but I hope gives you a sense of what you're trying to do with autocross. There's some very low speeds involved. You never leave second gear, so maximum speed is typically 100 kilometers an hour. But it's the most challenging driving I've done, except maybe for Knox Mountain, in the sense that, as you can see, steering inputs and changes of velocity come very quickly at you. You're always changing direction. You're always having to get on the brake, on the gas, steering, brake, gas, making that whole experience relatively challenging and actually bringing out some of the best in our local drivers. So what I'm hoping to do today, and this is a very, very broad audience. I know there's some of you in the audience that have maybe never driven a car, actually, let alone a race car. There's some of you here that race. There's some from Formula SAE and groups that probably know more about racing than I do, almost certainly. And I'm certainly not the fastest racer in the audience, so why am I even giving this lecture? I think I can bring a bit of these elements in. I mean, obviously I have a degree in physics and I've taught dynamics, kinematics, the sorts of physics that applies here. And I've spent enough time both racing and tuning and building my car that I'm sort of seeing some of the interplay here. And what I'm hoping to do really is for those of you that have never been racing to give you a bit of an appreciation of the complexity of the challenge. That it's not just a bunch of people driving around in circles as fast as they can. There's a lot on the human side, on the driver's side, that needs to be accomplished to do that well. For those of you that do race, I'm hoping to give you some physical intuition that underlies the things you already know. I don't think I'm going to tell you anything you don't know, right? Stiffen your front sway bar to, increase understeer, things like that, right? But I'm hoping that I will be able to give you some intuition around that so that you can extrapolate from what you know into things that you don't necessarily think you know yet. So I'll start with a little bit of driving theory, and I have the benefit of some slides from Ferrari that my friend in Switzerland sent me after he heard I gave this talk last year. So I'll cover a bit of that quickly, because I really do want to get into some of the more detailed physics and handling issues, and then we'll go on from there into some setup. So obviously driving fast around a lap is not really about the straight bits. Okay, you see people in the Formula 1 drivers fiddling with their steering wheels on the straights. There's not much to be done. Your foot is planted on the throttle. You're going as fast as you can. Everything happens in the turns, right? So racing is about bringing the speed of the car down for a turn, turning in, reaccelerating out of the turn. It sounds easy, but the timing, how much to brake, when to start turning the steering wheel, when to let go of the brakes, and how to blend all these together with timing accuracy on the order of 100 millisecond, that's the real challenge of racing. And ultimately, the limits you're going to hit come all from the level of grip between the car tires and the ground. So almost all the physics we're going to deal with eventually relates to how does that change the grip between the tires and the ground on the car. So before we even start, I really do need to give you a bit of an introduction to car tires. They're rubber. So they behave in a certain way that's different from the first year physics friction that you've been taught. Okay? When you're driving straight, your car tires are rolling, they're deflecting when they hit the ground. The point where the tires touch the ground, where the rubber is making contact, is called a contact patch. I'll be referring to that, so I'm going to introduce some language here. When you want to start turning the car, you turn the steering wheel. What does that do? It changes the angle of the tire away from the direction of the car, right? So when you turn the steering wheel, you rotate your front tires, so the tires are now pointing in a direction different from the direction that the car is traveling in. That angle is called the slip angle. As soon as that happens, the rubber starts to bend, right? So the tires are rotating as the rubber hits the road, rotating into the contact patch. And if you look at this, that would be what the contact patch would look like if you're looking through a glass window through the floor, right, through the road. The rubber hits the road, and now because it's rotating in a different direction than the direction of travel, it starts to bend towards the inside of the car like a rubber band. And when it leaves the contact patch, it snaps back into the tire, into its normal point. That bending is what gives you your cornering force. So at low velocities and at low slip angles, the cornering force is purely elastic. You're bending the tire's producing a force that pushes the car into the corner as you're intending. Not surprisingly, if you keep increasing the slip angle, that rubber is deforming more and more. And just like a rubber band would break if you stretch it, right, hard enough, the rubber deforms to the point where its available friction actually starts to fall. It's basically getting too smushed, okay? So that's why the tire curve looks something like this. This is from Millikan. This is the slip angle. You keep increasing the slip angle, so you turn the steering wheel more and more. The force available increases. This is not coefficient of friction. This is available cornering force. It's elastic. Still, basically, the rubber starts to deform, and you lose grip, and it starts to slide or even melt, right? So a race tire at the end of the day, and these are pretty fresh tires, they're mine, but you can see molten rubber starting to appear on the inside of the tire, that it has flowed from the outside towards the inside as it's you've exceeded the cornering forces and the rubber's actually started to move. This point is your limit of grip, all right? So that is the maximum grip you can achieve out of that tire under the conditions in which this has been measured, which includes the weight on the tire, how much force was on top of the tire holding it down to the ground from the car. Interestingly, and I would not have expected this until I started to look this stuff up, that maximum grip is relatively isotropic. It doesn't matter whether you're asking for friction laterally or whether you're asking for braking or acceleration friction in the longitudinal direction. They're roughly the same. So you can actually have a maximum force vector, a maximum acceleration vector, right? So going back to Newton's second law, if you have the force of friction is F equals mu n, right? So n is the normal force in this direction. I have the Steph's model of her S2000 here as an example, right? The normal force is from the road into the tire. That's what supports the weight of the car, right? And as we know, again, from sort of high school physics, the friction force available to you, the maximum friction force available, is some friction coefficient times that normal force. That force, the friction force that's going to be lateral, is what's pushing on the car to turn it when you're entering a corner, right? Now, because the mass, which is the car, that out these masses normally and end up with your maximum acceleration in the car being some friction coefficient times g, right? 9.8 meters per second squared. So when you hear racers talk about, oh, you were cornering at 1.5 Gs, right? What they're saying is we were cornering with a friction coefficient of 1.5 effectively, which hopefully is, the limit of the car. Now that coefficient is roughly the same, as I said, in different axes. And if you look at the total friction coefficient in any direction, you form a circle that's what we call your traction budget, or the traction circle. That's how much friction you can get in any direction. Not necessarily in the same direction, right? So you can get maybe 1.5 Gs of acceleration under braking, 1.5 Gs under right turn, left turn. It's always flat on top, because for most cars, unless you drive a very high horsepower car, the engine power limits how fast you can accelerate, right? So you're not usually traction limited on acceleration, except in first gear and where you see readings up here, okay? So these are all acceleration readings plotted. This is from one of my Knox runs, I think. And showing you the effective envelope of performance of the tire. So knowing that, and knowing that you have to stay within that maximum grip, right? I want to talk a little bit about racing lines. Now, this is the only slide I'm going to show all evening on racing lines, because the racers know a lot about this, and I don't want to get into a huge discussion with everyone else, because I want to get into some other stuff. But just very briefly, going around a course, you have to pick the fastest line. Now that depends on what you're driving, right? So again, from the Ferrari slides, they show 3 lines, which they give really cool names, like progressive fast for what we would call a late apex line. But the blue line is clearly the shortest line. If you have to go around this 180-degree hairpin, and you want to take the shortest possible line, you would take the blue line. If you're driving a golf cart, that's the racing line, guaranteed. Okay? Because you can't go fast enough to exceed the limit of grip. Now, the problem with that racing line is that it is quite tight. If you have a fast car, you're going to be limited. I'd say, say you're on street tires and it's 1 G of maximum acceleration, maximum coefficient of friction. In that line, they've calculated you might get a speed of 50 kilometers an hour. Your steering wheel, your front wheels, you've steered them, turned them about 10 degrees to make that tight turn. And remember, the centripetal acceleration required to turn the car around a corner, right, is v squared over r. So if you're limited in acceleration, so a becomes a constant for whatever tires you're running, let's say it's 1, the maximum velocity that you can achieve goes as something like the radius to the 1/2. So if you quadruple the radius of a turn, you can drive it twice as fast, right? So it makes sense to increase the radius of the turn if you want to carry more speed. So the green line becomes a more sensible racing line, right? You can carry now, because the turn is only an 8-degree turn, you can carry something like 65 kilometers an hour around that turn instead of 50 kilometers an hour. In some cars, in some situations, that's the correct line. And by the way, they've identified these little points, which we call the apex, right? So you start from the outside of the turn, you hit the apex, you go back to the outside. The reason that's the line is it makes the biggest possible circle within this hairpin. That's the biggest radius turn that you can do. Interestingly, that's not usually the racing line that we take. The racing line most of us take is called the late apex line, which they call the progressive fast, which is where you come into a turn a little bit more slowly. You're coming in at maybe 50 kilometers an hour and turning quite sharp early on. The advantage that this gives you is very early in the turn, you can start to straighten the steering wheel and make the car less dependent on turning friction, so you can apply more acceleration friction and get on the gas much, much sooner. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But that line, you enter it at 50 kilometers an hour, but you exit at 80 kilometers an hour. If there's any significant length of a straight after this corner, that's going to be the faster line, right? So if you watch 3 cars in this, the blue car and the green car are going to be ahead of the red car early on. But as you start to exit the turn, the green car would overtake the blue one halfway through the turn, and the red one would overtake the green one as you get further down the straight. And you'll see Formula 1 cars take different lines like this in different turns. Okay, so that's roughly the line we're going to try and follow. We're going to make the biggest circle we can within the turn, but we're going to try to turn in a little bit earlier so we get the straightest possible path out of the turn and get the highest level of acceleration that we can. So the sequence of events goes roughly as follows. If you're racing, you're hard on the gas, okay, you're going as fast as you possibly can until the very, very last moment that you have to hit the brakes or you won't be able to bring the speed down enough to make the turn. At that moment, you slam on completely on the brakes, right? The acceleration vector goes completely, if you're doing it right, completely to the maximum braking acceleration, and the car started to slow down. When you exit the braking zone, now you start to turn the steering wheel. Remember, at this point, you're starting to blend a little bit of braking and a little bit of turning because you're limited by that traction budget. So you have to, spend a little bit on one and a little bit of the other. And you get into the middle of the turn, at which point all you're doing is turning. The steering wheel is turned over all the way hard. You're not on the gas or the brake. But as soon as you can, you start to get on the gas a little bit and start to straighten the steering wheel and progressively increase the gas as you straighten the steering wheel to try to keep balancing, right, the friction demands of acceleration in this axis with the friction demands of cornering until you're basically going straight, and then you can be 100% back on the gas. That's the progression. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. I'm going to show you an example quickly. And this is Vettel in Singapore. And this video shows the brake and throttle. So you can see but so you see that sort of sequence, right? Maximum braking, turning, and then progressively back on the gas as the steering wheel starts to straighten, hopefully staying at the limit of grip throughout the whole exercise. Now, as I said in the intro, racing is about being at that limit of grip, but also being on the right line. You have to achieve both. And you can calculate this very simply for a type of corner that doesn't exist in Formula 1, I don't think. But that we do frequently in Autocross, which is a full circle. It's very easy to calculate. You have a car coming in and they have to go around a circle of cones of radius 10 meters and then they come back out. What's the fastest line? There's no going from the outside to the inside of the track here, okay? So the fastest line is actually the geometric tight line, right? The line that keeps it closest to the cones. So if you can have a maximum, say you're on street tires, you have a maximum lateral acceleration of 1g. That line with a 10-meter radius has a total distance of about 15.7 meters going around the circle. You can reach a velocity of about 36 kilometers an hour with that 10-meter radius. That's again from A equals v squared over r, solving for v. That's your maximum velocity. That takes 1.57 seconds. That's on the limit of grip, on the right line. To get to that limit of grip, you end up drifting off that line. So now you're a meter wider than the cones, right? The cones are 10-meter radius, you end up at 11 meters. You go faster because it's a bigger radius. You're doing 38 kilometers an hour, but the distance you travel is 17 meters instead of 15, and your total time is 1/10 of a second slower, right? So you have to be at the limit of grip, but you also have to be on the right line. Like, you have to achieve both. Similarly, if you are on the right line, you're a radius of 10 meters, but to be on that line, you're being cautious with the gas. So you only are cornering at 0.8 Gs, right, 32 kilometers an hour, then you're even slower, right? You lose 0.2 of a second. So this is fundamentally, and you can apply this across any corner, but fundamentally this is the reason you have to be at the limit of grip on the right line in every turn. So let's go through the Ferrari slides again, but now breaking them down into all the effects that will happen as the car starts to enter a turn. So first of all, the braking zone. And this, for the novices, and I hope there's some novice drivers in the room, this is an area where a lot of people can improve on track at Autocross. The initiation of braking in the few moments before are very counterintuitive compared to what people do on the street. right? If you're heading towards a stop sign, you're not usually at full throttle, okay? And if you are, which I hope you're not, right, you don't wait until the very last possible second to hit the brakes so you stop just in time for the stop sign with your tires squealing, okay? But that's exactly what you do racing, because you have to go as fast as you can. So if you're doing 200 kilometers an hour, you're coming up to a turn, that's a 50 kilometer an hour turn, you're going to keep your foot full on the throttle until the very, very last moment where you know you can scrub 150 kilometers an hour of your speed, and just in time to turn in, you'll have brought it down to the right turn. You don't want to do this wrong, right? If you brake too late at that point, for every 1/10 of a second you're too late, you're something like 10 meters further down the track, which usually means into a wall or into the dirt. So it's very important when you start braking that you switch from gas to brake as fast as possible, right? If you're not, you're wasting time. If you're not and you make the turn, you could have hit the brakes later, or you could have been on the gas for longer. So a good driver, I think, can switch from gas to brake in something like 2/10 of a second, a couple hundred milliseconds. That's why a lot of us racing left foot brake, right? It takes a lot of years of practice to make that work well, but if you can, and I think most of the Formula One drivers now do, you can lift off the gas and get on the brake almost simultaneously. You don't want to overlap, but you can do that very, very quickly, so you're not wasting time in between. Once you're on the brakes, if you have anti-lock brakes, life is a little bit easier for you because you get to the braking threshold, you can feel the anti-lock brakes kick in, and you just sort of stay just below that if you can. If you don't have anti-lock brakes, you have to carefully judge the braking limit so that you don't lock up your tires and start skidding, because obviously your coefficient of friction then rapidly drops as well. But you maintain that braking force as long as you can, and then you slowly start to release it, because at some point you're going to want to start turning the steering wheel to get into the turn. And again, you have a traction budget. If you're using it all for braking, you're not going to be using it for turning. And this is where things start to go wrong for people, right? You're heading into a turn, you're on the brakes, maybe you've hit the brakes a little bit too late, or maybe you weren't quite braking hard enough at the beginning of the braking zone. But you still need to scrub up speed as you get into the turn, but you also need to turn. So you're still on the brakes and you turn the steering wheel. If you do that, you end up in braking understeer. Okay, braking induced understeer. In other words, you're asking your tires to provide you an acceleration vector of, say, 1.5 Gs in braking, and you start to turn the steering wheel, so you're saying, please give me at least half a G or a G to turn. And the resulting vector, if you add those two accelerations, is bigger than your grip limit. And what typically happens is that if you stomp on the brakes and start to turn the steering wheel, your slip angle increases dramatically without generating much cornering force, because the tires are already deformed, right? It's already being deformed by braking, so you don't have that elastic region anymore. You're straight into the frictional region. And, well, the car goes straight instead of turn, okay? What you do at that point, of course, and recovering from understeer is quite difficult. The only thing you can really do is just get off the brakes and turn, right? And usually that's the safest thing to do. Give yourself at least your traction to turn so you can correct your line. You may go wide around the turn, but hopefully you don't go straight into a wall, which is roughly what this person did. So this is Knox Mountain. I think it's turn 8. I'm afraid I don't know the name. Pulled this off YouTube. It's one of my competitors at Knox. But watch the steering wheel as he takes a left-hander coming into turn 8. It makes me sad every time I watch it because he looks really dejected. But look at the front wheels now of the car from outside. They're tilted completely in. The car should be turning, but it can't. The car can't turn. Those wheels, despite being turned into the turn, are using all their friction for braking. Well, it's worse than that. Even if you get the braking right, cars tend to understeer entering turns, particularly if you throw them into a turn too quick. Now, I showed this slide last year, but I didn't actually go through the calculations of what this really meant, and I've done that now, and it's actually shocking, and I just want to lead you through it. So I have to define a whole lot of things here. So a car has mass. That mass rests on the tires and gives you the normal force that gives you friction, right? That's what allows you to change the direction of the car. The car also has what's called a polar moment of inertia. The polar axis of the car, or the yaw axis, is the line that goes through the center of the car vertically. So yaw rotation or polar rotation is rotation of the car like this. And if you're doing, as in this case, a left-hander, that's 180 degrees. The car enters the turn and it has to turn 180 degrees. We don't think about it when we're driving because the car's moving forward, right? But if you put the car on a frictionless turntable and say, okay, turn the car 180 degrees for me, you'd have to push really hard to get the car moving, right? It has inertia. It has inertia in that direction as well. And once you get it moving, if you just get on the other side and go, I'll stop it now, right? You get knocked to the ground, okay? That inertia does not come strictly from the mass of the car. It comes from what's called the polar moment of the car. Now, the polar moment is the sum of all the little masses in the car multiplied by the square of the distance of those masses to the center of rotation of the car. But I'm just going to interrupt for just a second because I know there's a handful of seats here and there's the stairs. So if you guys are getting uncomfortable at the back, please feel free to come and sit down the aisles or the stairs. I hate to see you stand for the next 3 hours. My students don't think it's funny. They've seen me lecture. No, it's shorter than that. It's good. So, unfortunately, the way people tend to design cars for safety reasons, right? There's bumpers at the front and back, which are quite heavy, crash structures at the front and back, which are quite heavy, and an engine, which is usually the heaviest component, which is normally placed at the front of the car. Now, this is why cars like the Ferraris and incredibly the Toyota MR2, right, place the engine, where's my mouse, right here, right behind the driver. It's the right place for the engine in a car because it gives the lowest polar moment. In fact, I've convinced myself that the MR2 is called the MR2 because that is the formula for the polar moment. I don't know if it's true, but I looked at it and go, oh, because it's a very low polar moment car. Anyways, so let's say you have a car with a high polar moment. You have to rotate it. You're going to have to apply a moment to rotate the car, right? That's a force couple, one on the front axle, one on the rear axle. The tires, of course, are the only place we can exert force from the road. That's what's touching the road. So as the car goes around this turn, it's going to be subject to centripetal acceleration, right? So the tires have to provide a force that's mv squared over r, right? That's the centripetal force. Half of that on each tire, or half of that on each axle. But on top of that, Newton's second law in polar coordinates also applies. F equals ma becomes T equals I alpha. There's a torque required to turn the mass I, which is a moment of inertia now, at an acceleration alpha. So that force is applied here through the wheelbase. A longer wheelbase actually helps you here. But unfortunately, a longer wheelbase car probably also has a higher polar moment. So I suspect it cancels out in a very bad way, right? So shorter wheelbase cars tend to turn better. Now, the forces required to do that depend greatly on the angular acceleration. Most of us can't fiddle with the moment of inertia of our car, unless, like me, you chop bits off, right? But we can play with the angular acceleration required in any given turn. Now, the angular acceleration is the angular velocity in the turn divided by the time that it took you to set up the car into that turn. Now, when I say angular velocity, I don't mean the speed of the car around a turn. I mean, how much does the car rotate in degrees per second in the reference frame of the car? So if the car rotates 180 degrees in 3 seconds, your angular velocity is 60 degrees per second. I don't care if that was at 200 kilometers an hour or 50 kilometers an hour. That angular velocity stays the same. They're two very different turns, obviously, but that angular velocity stays the same. And the angular acceleration is if you're entering a turn, right, that was 180 degrees and lasted 3 seconds, how long did you spend in that transition between the car being straight and the car starting to rotate at that velocity? If you do that quite quickly, that's going to generate a high angular acceleration. So I tried to model it for my M3, or a slightly lightened version of my M3. And I assumed that we had a hairpin, like I said, 180 degrees, so pi radians, divided by 3 seconds. That's the angular velocity. And we're going to set that up in 0.2 seconds, 200 milliseconds. I came up with all these numbers off the top of my head, but they seem maybe reasonable. I mean, you can argue it and we can change them a little bit. That would give you an angular acceleration of 5 radians per second squared. In a sweeper, right, so now you have a 90-degree corner that takes you 6 seconds to navigate. So already the angular velocity is much lower than you need to achieve. And you're going to get to that in a longer time, because if it's a long sweeper, you don't have to flick the steering wheel suddenly to get into it. You can gradually get into it. Maybe that takes half a second. And then angular acceleration could be as low as a half a radian per second squared. Point being, if I calculate that force required on the axles to rotate the car and compare that to the force that you're asking the axles for cornering, it turns out to be 25%. It's a massive number. This is for the hairpin. For the sweeper, it's 2%. So it gives you a sense, I hope, right, of why it is so difficult to throw a car into a turn and why your coaches at Autocross will always be telling you, drive smoothly. Because if you make sudden transitions in steering on the car, you're going to invoke this yaw inertia, and you're going to suddenly be asking your front axle for a lot of grip that it doesn't have. And that will lead to understeer. So in summary, if you have a high polar moment car, you can do one of a couple of things. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I heard music. You can move the masses towards the front of the car, or sorry, towards the middle of the car, or buy a Ferrari, right? If that's neither of those are options, you have to ease the car into turns. Okay? Even a hairpin, you just change your line a little bit and try to get the transition from being straight to rotating to last a little bit longer. That'll require less grip from the axles, and you'll actually get more grip coming into the turn. To save time, I'm not going to talk about it, but the exact thing happens in reverse at the exit of the turn, right? As you can imagine, the car is now rotating, you have to stop it. That tends to generate corner exit oversteer. So most race cars that are properly set up tend to understeer in corner entry and oversteer in corner exit. And this is part of the reason, not the only reason. Now you have some tools to counteract this understeer, and trail braking is one of them. So I wanted to work through that a little bit to show you how that works. Now, trail braking, as the word implies, is that moment when you're not fully on the brakes anymore. You've let go of the brakes a little bit, but you're starting to turn in. So you're trailing on your brakes. Like you keep your foot on your brakes and you start to turn in. It helps you corner. And the reason it helps you corner is a little bit magical. It's the mass of the car being pushed forward, right? So, and I'm using words like inertial force, which other physicists would probably kick me for, but I think it's more intuitive, right? You hit the brakes in a car, you lurch forward, right? You know, everyone feels that. Well, the car's doing the same thing on top of its wheels, right? And the center of gravity of the car, if you had to find that point on the car where if you coalesced all its mass, it would sort of be balanced in the same way, right? That center of gravity is not in line with a contact patch that would put it at ground level. It's high up on the car, and 20, 30, 40 centimeters off the ground. So if you're braking at, say, half a G, so for a race car, that's sort of 30% of your braking force. You've come off the brakes a fair bit. The car wants to pitch forward, right? So this is now rotating on the pitch axis. The pitch axis goes through the doors horizontally. So the car's trying to do this. It's trying to rotate forward. And the reason it can't is the front axle stops it. There's springs there that hold up the car, and you're starting to compress those springs. But through that spring compression, you generate a force that counteracts that pitch moment. So the pitch moment is this inertial force, which is the mass of the car times whatever deceleration, half a G in this case. It's that force times this moment arm. I'm going to take moments around this red point, okay, which is the contact point of the rear axle to the ground. So the moment is that 1,300 kilograms times a half a G times, say, 25 centimeters for the height of the center of gravity off the ground. So as you can already tell, this is going to be more significant if you have a high center of gravity. It's a lesser effect if you have a low center of gravity. That moment has to be counteracted by a force which is applied, as I said, through the front axle springs that hold the car up. And that force is going to be this moment divided by the wheelbase. Because in this case, there's a moment to oppose the pitch moment, which is the normal force times this wheelbase of 270 centimeters. That creates an additional force on the front wheels. But the really cool thing about that force is it doesn't come with any additional mass. Right, so the calculation we just went through, Newton's second law, F equals ma, right? So the coordinate acceleration required is proportional to what's available in terms of friction, right? So you have mu n as the friction equation equals ma. The normal force, if it's due to the mass of the car, it's on the front of the car, so the frontal mass, that's mu m times g. You cancel out the masses, right? And you're left with acceleration as mu g like we had before. But once you have this pitch moment, the normal force is not just the mass of the car times g anymore. It's the mass of the car times g plus the force that's used to oppose that pitch moment, right? So it's this, whatever that turns out to be. Again, roughly calculating it for one of my cars, this comes out to about 60 kilograms of force. When I use the unit 60 kilograms of force, it's 600 newtons, right? It's 60 kilograms times g, so about 600. So whereas normally you'd have 780 kilograms of mass on the front axle, you still have 780 kilograms of mass, right? But now you have the normal force is 780 plus 60. You have about 8% more normal force, but the amount of mass you need to accelerate into the turn hasn't changed. So this is a dramatic effect, right? It's not like, well, we've just put more weight on the front axle. If you put more weight on the front axle, you have to accelerate more weight sideways. So that doesn't really help you win. But this is a force. It's like an invisible hand pushing down the front of the car and helping your front tires stick. Comes at a price, of course. The rear axle loses 12% grip. The reason the rear axle loses in percentage more than the front is the rear axle is more lightly loaded to begin with. So the more lightly loaded axle feels this effect more strongly. But both of those, so more grip on the front, less on the rear, leads to a condition called oversteer, right? Where the front is gripping better than the rear, the slip angle in the rear starts to grow, and the car starts to rotate, right, in a direction that people call spinning out, right, where the rear end comes around. Okay. But if you're understeering to begin with, right, this trail braking can help you counteract that understeer. But it has a relatively narrow window, and this is something I've been exploring for a few years now with my car setup, because you can play around with the size of that window. So, as I said, if you hit on the brakes hard enough and you ask your front wheels of all the traction they've got for braking, you can't turn the steering wheel, so that leads to braking understeer. When you're not applying brakes at all, you can ask for all the lateral traction you want, and the car, if it's been set up right, is neutral. But I think there's a curve that looks something like this. This is my sketch in PowerPoint. It's not data, just to be clear. But I think a very light braking, you can get into an oversteer situation. And then as you brake harder and harder, the braking understeer starts to kick in, and eventually at high brake effort, you end up in understeer. So there's a very nice spot where you can operate as you're coming into a turn where if you've got just the right amount of braking, the trail braking will rotate the car into the turn with a tiny bit of oversteer and help you get on a nice tight line so you can get on the gas earlier coming out of the turn. Cars with a rear weight bias feel this more strongly because the front axle is more lightly loaded. So the percentage change on the front axle becomes more significant. Now, there's a whole lot of spring selection, shock selection issues that affect trail braking. And depending on when you expect your trail braking to happen, you might want to adjust those. In a car where you're heavy on the brakes, so you're braking at the hardest possible amount of deceleration, and then you get off the brakes gradually, the car's already pitched onto the front axle, and I don't think the shocks or springs are going to matter that much. You'll get some trail braking in. If you're what's called brush braking, I think, right, where you're coming into a turn, you're just touching the brakes and you want to get a little bit of turn in from that, you'd better have stiff shocks and suspension, because otherwise the car will start to pitch forward and it may move a few inches before that force actually starts to get significantly transferred to the front axle, right? So I don't know how many of you have experienced that you can lock up your front axle before you actually get any trail braking, right? And in fact, I think I'll talk about it later, but just while I'm on the topic, soft front suspension can lead you to lock up your front tires because you don't have this weight transfer to the front wheels right away. So if you stomp on your brakes suddenly in a car that's very softly sprung, you'll lock up your tires if it doesn't have ABS before you have a chance to transfer that weight onto the front axle. At the same time, once the car is pitched forward, right, so the car is leading forward onto its front springs, they're heavily compressed because of this pitch moment from braking. When you get off the brakes, what's going to happen? Right? Those front springs are going to restore the front height of the car. So they're pushing up on the car. Newton's third law, right, is that implies there's an opposite force pushing down on the wheels. That's the same. And that also would lead to trail braking. So in some cars, this can be very dramatic, right? You get hard on the brakes. If you lift off the brakes and turn, the front axle will stick like glue. My daughter found this out on Sunday, right? Braking hard into the left-hander at the far back of the pad, hard on the brakes, and magically sort of managed to lift and turn at exactly the same time and went for a spin, which is fine. Don't worry. So I think trail braking has hysteresis. I think the curve that you'd follow under application of brakes is not necessarily the same curve that you follow on release of braking, but you can get trail braking in both directions. So ultimately, trail braking is your tool for counteracting turn and understeer. Again, of course, car setup is as well. But you ultimately have to experiment to see how strongly it impacts your car, when does it impact your car. If you're trying to touch the brakes and try to get trail braking on just brushing the brakes and it's not working, you might want to stiffen your front shocks or stiffen your front springs and see if you can transfer that way a little bit earlier so that it can happen immediately when you start braking. Okay, so now we're into the turn. At this point, you're kind of off the gas, you're off the brakes, you're turning the car as hard as you can. Hopefully you're at the limit of grip in lateral acceleration. And the only thing to be said there is if you're a good driver, you'll be right at the limit of grip. And again, for novices, this is one of the things to work on, because a lot of novices will come into a turn, they'll mistake their speed, they'll come in too fast, and then they're turning really hard, but the car's drifting wide because they're going too fast. And then they turn the steering wheel hard, and that generally tends to generate some kind of understeer. Or they're not turning hard enough, and they're not at the limit of grip, and so forth. A good race driver will be able to trail brake into a turn and turn the car and be exactly at the limit of grip throughout the turn until they can get on the gas. Now, adjusting that limit is done through brake, through gas, right? So if you're going too slow, you can turn harder and tighten up your line and try to stay at the edge of grip. But ultimately, the fastest line is the one that keeps you at the edge of grip all the time, and the one that's the smoothest, right? Also, changing the steering, doing this as you're going through a turn, other than the fact that it takes you on a very strange line, also will tend to upset the car because you'll be rocking it back and forth while you're trying to keep it at the limit of its grip, which isn't very helpful. Okay, so now we get on to turn exit. At this point, you've got the wheel cranked over as far as it's going to go, and now it's time to start that progression of getting on the gas and starting to unwind the steering wheel. Again, conscious of the fact that you're currently asking for all of your traction budget in turning, and as you start to accelerate, you're going to need some of that traction budget for acceleration. Now, most of my discussion here is aimed at rear drive cars. This will apply to front drive cars as well in a different way. But what will happen as you start to go through that progression, if you're not careful, which usually means not being patient enough, right? You want to go faster, so you get on the gas hard, and you're still turning, but you ask for a lot of power, is whatever axle is being driven will start to slide. If you're in a front drive car, this will lead to understeer. If you're in a rear drive car, it will lead to power oversteer. Right? This is how people do donuts in parking lots, right? You crank the wheel over, you stamp on the gas as hard as you can, the rear wheels have no lateral grip left, so the whole car spins sideways. And oversteer leads, well, roughly to this, as you'd expect. The front end turns in well, the rear end starts to come around, and things go very badly. This is me at Knox, getting out of turn one and just being a little eager on the gas. So for a brief moment, looking like I was going to go over the edge and towards the lake. Do I have another one? No, okay. Now, like trail braking in corner entry, you have some tools to fix power oversteer in corner exit, and there's power understeer. So very much like the trail braking line, depending on how much power you apply, there's different effects that can come into play. And power-induced understeer is exactly the same effect as trail braking, so I can be pretty quick on this slide, because really what's happening is now you hit the gas and you get thrown back into your seat, right? Well, the car is being thrown back onto its rear axle, so you're shifting weight off the front axle onto the rear axle, exactly the same calculation. Front axle loses 8% of its grip, rear axle picks up 12% grip, right? So in coming out of a turn, that's lifting the front end and causing loss of grip of the front end that will tend to lead you into understeer. But you can counteract that with the power oversteer, so you can balance those two if you're very careful. And it's an aside, if you're launching at Autocross or in a race, right? You're on the line, light goes green, and you have to launch as fast as possible. If you have a rear drive car, you have the benefit of as the rear wheels start to generate some traction, the mass of the car, right, is generating this pitch moment back onto the rear axle, and you're actually getting something like an extra 10% grip. So if you're very good at this, right, you'll just add about 10% power as you start a launch. And if you get it right, you'll know it, right? You're just perfectly hooked up. The wheels are sliding at roughly 10% slip angle, and you take off as fast as possible. If you get on the gas too hard before you do that weight transfer, you never get a chance to have the weight transfer because your wheels are a very low friction coefficient and they're just sliding. And if you don't give enough gas, it's just slow. The obvious. So this transition, and again, this is me sketching, but I feel this is roughly how this plays out. As you apply more power on corner exit, again, for a front drive car, it's going to understeer. Okay, I haven't driven one in a long time. I hope I'm not wrong, but you're asking the front axle for your acceleration power. You break that, your traction budget on the front axle, the car will tend to understeer. With the rear drive car, you have this wonderful situation where you're pitching weight backwards, right? So you're taking weight off the front axle. It should understeer, and it will understeer. But if you keep getting on the power, right, first of all, you get more power, you're going faster, but the front, or the rear end now starts to increase its slip angle because you're asking more of the traction at that point. So you're starting to exceed your traction budget on the rear end. So you've got loss of traction now at both axles, but in a balanced way. And this is another one of those things that if you can nail this point, if you can get this right, and on the weekend I had like maybe one turn all weekend where I really got that right, where the car was just, it was like understeering as you get on, you get more on the gas and it starts to oversteer, and then you're sort of in this perfect drift as you leave the turn. Not drift like drifters, because that's like slow, that's really slow, right? But just a little bit of slip angle on both wheels, staying on a good line and exiting the turn as fast as possible. So again, for those of you that don't race, this is some of the challenge you have in racing, right? Is you're balancing multiple effects, and most of it is not done through the physics. You just sort of have this intuition of how this works, and a good driver will know and will be able to balance these and absolutely nail it. It'd be great. So in summary, one of the things I would say for you to think about. Oh, good. At least we didn't lose power. Okay. Ask yourself, if you're looking at these effects of, what's going to happen when I engine brake, right? I lift off the throttle, what happens, right? Well, the car will massively oversteer in a rear drive car, right? Ask yourself which axle is providing the friction to give you this pitch moment, and which axle is benefiting from the pitch moment. If you ask yourself those questions, you ought to be able to figure out what the behavior will be that you should be expecting. So I want to leave this section on driving theory with a video from one of our fastest drivers in the club. This is Norm, who's sitting right there. I'm going to embarrass him. Norm took first place in his class, which is F-Stock Street Tire, at Packwood this year. I watched him do it. It was beautiful. This is his video. I'd like you to watch it, and don't look at the actual driving. Look at the G-circle. So there's going to be a little orange dot that's moving around. The axes are swapped. So where it says acceleration, that's actually braking, and braking is actually acceleration, right? So those are flipped around. So keep that in mind. But watch how Norm manages to keep the car on the edge of grip almost all the time, right? That's how I managed. This is a very competitive event, by the way. So all the top people in the U.S. come out to events like this, and Norm managed to beat them all. Watch the video. But watch the dot. So picking up speed. Okay, now starting to hit grip limit, right hand, braking, left hand. Did you see that transition from braking to left hand? He was at the grip limit the whole time as he was coming off the brakes and turning, right? Again, same thing. Almost always at the absolute edge of the traction circle. And still getting to within a couple of inches of these cones. So I know this doesn't look as exciting as driving like 200 kilometers an hour on a track, but it's way harder because the level of accuracy required here is absolutely phenomenal. So congrats to Norm for some great driving there. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of the challenge involved in staying at the limit, being accurate on the line while balancing all these different grip effects on the car, and essentially being entirely at the limit of grip all the time. So what I want to talk about now is a little bit about lateral weight transfer and car setup. Okay, and this is where there's some additional physics, obviously. But first of all, for those of you, if you're going to follow that don't race and don't work on cars, a little bit of suspension basics. Your wheels are attached to the car through springs and shocks. You know that already. Sorry, I don't want to be condescending. But there's a spring that a lot of you maybe don't know about, which is called a roll bar or a sway bar. Now, the tires, again, transmit the force of the car through these springs, through these shocks. The amount of force opposing movement of the wheel, vertical movement of the wheel, is proportional to the spring force if both wheels are moving together. There's an additional spring called the sway bar that connects the two bits of suspension. With that spring, it's a spring, right? But it's just a tube. What that spring does is if one wheel moves up and the other one does not, it provides a restoring force. Otherwise, it doesn't do anything. So if you have a bump that bumps this wheel up in the car, you get a restoring force based on this spring and based on the sway bar. What happens as a result of that is under braking, these springs are really the spring force. Under cornering, the sway bar adds its spring force to your suspension springs. So it's really meant to keep your car from rolling over too far under corners, right? Okay, that's all I need to tell you. So just having a little bit of a look at what happens when you corner. As you can tell, you still have this inertial force, right, that people would call centrifugal force, but it's the inertial reaction force to cornering. You're trying to accelerate the car into the turn, and the car doesn't want to turn. So there's a force rolling the car towards the outside of the turn. That force is the mass of the car times the acceleration, the centripetal acceleration of the turn. Okay? In this case, I've again modeled, what have I modeled here? Maybe something like my race car on race tires, so 1.3 Gs. Actually, no, because the center of gravity is lower. But anyways, this is some hybrid between my street car and my race car. Now, what that force is going to do is, again, it creates a roll moment. Now, the roll axis, we've talked about the yaw axis, the pitch axis, right? The roll axis is this axis. It's the car trying to tip over on one side. Okay? So again, the cornering force is causing a roll, and that roll gets counteracted by a moment that's delivered through the tires, right? So now the tires have the usual weight on them, and I picked 1,200 kilograms here to make the math easy. I realize my car's not that light. But 1,200 kilograms by 4, so each tire has 300 kilograms of normal force on it just from the weight of the car. But once it starts to roll, it picks up an additional 220 kilograms on the outside tires, and that force is removed from the inside tires. And you can see this, right? I mean, you can see my front wheel here is virtually off the ground. Okay? So a lot of weight has been shifted to the outside tire. So the outside normal force is now 520 kilograms, and the inside normal force of the inside tires is something like 80 kilograms. I've assumed the two axles are the same for now, but that's fine. So what, right? So why does that matter? The reason that matters is there's an element of the tire friction that I haven't talked about yet, which is how does the tire maximum friction coefficient, right? So that point at the top of the curve, how does that shift when you add more mass on top of the tire, or when you load the tire more, you're adding more weight to the pressing down on the tire. And this is where tire friction differs from your sort of high school friction of a block sliding down an inclined plane, right? The friction coefficient is dependent on the normal force. F equals mu n applies, but mu is dependent on n, so it becomes quite a complex formula in the end. And so it looks something like this, right? You can have the friction coefficient as a function of vertical load on the tire, and the heavier you press, the more you press on the tire, the lower its friction abilities become, right? And again, because it's made of rubber, you sort of intuitively get this, that you're squashing the heck out of the rubber in the bottom of the tire. It's not going to be that happy, right? It works better when it's just lightly loaded and, it can stick to the road. So what happens, right? So when you corner, before you corner, your car has a potential for getting 1.3 Gs of grip, okay? So you look up vertical load, there's 300 kilograms on each tire, right? So the car weighs 1,200, so distribute over the 4 tires, 300 kilograms each. And that tells you on this graph, it should have a coefficient of friction of 1.3 G. And then you get into a turn, right? Then the outside tires shift from 300 kilograms of load to 520 kilograms of load. And the inside tires get lightened, so they shift from 300 down to 80 kilograms of load. So the weight is being transferred onto the outside tires. And at first blush you go, well look, the outside tires have less grip, the inside tires have more grip, it evens out, but it comes nothing close to evening out because the outside tires, because they have a greater proportion of the normal force, that friction coefficient starts to dominate. So if you go through the calculation, now you're getting maybe 1.1 G's of available friction on the outside tires, 1.4 on the inside tires. You go through the calculation, your net acceleration, available grip in that turn is now 1.14 G's. So you've lost 0.2 of a G of acceleration of potential grip. And for those of you that race around one of our courses, 1/10 of a G is probably a second. Okay? So you've lost a lot of grip. So what do? You set up your car to minimize this split, right? So this is one of the most important concepts that helped me sort of think about car setup, is this split of forces between the inside and outside wheels, right, on a curve that defines the coefficient of friction as a function of load. Right? So you have a potential grip at 1.3, your actual grip is 1.1. You're going to try to minimize that split any way you can. And then the other important thing is that split, you have to balance it between the front and the rear axle, because otherwise, if one axle grips better than the other, you'll end up in either understeer or oversteer. Okay? So let's first of all lower the car, right? What everyone wants to do first, which is great. Actually, it helps immensely. Okay? Because as you lower the car, if we go back a couple of slides, right? That roll moment is this force times this height. It's times the center of gravity height. If you lower the center of gravity, the roll moment the car needs to absorb becomes less. And these points shift in. They shift inward. So if you drop the center of gravity from 40 centimeters to 30 centimeters, so you've lowered the car by 10 centimeters, you actually get an extra 1/10 of a G of grip in this calculation. Now, these are arbitrary, by the way. If you want to do this for yourself, you have to get this curve for your tires, which is not easy to come by, I can tell you. Okay. Anyway, so lowering the car will decrease the moment, right, because it depends on the center of gravity. Increased track width would do the same, right? So again, the counteracting moment is multiplied by the track width, so the distance between your left and right tires. This is why, you know, like Lamborghinis, right? Super wide, super low. Very low center of mass, very wide. They'll tend to corner nicely. Don't buy one. The other thing you can do is lighten the car. Now, lighten the car is hence my angle grinder thing, right? It's the best thing you can possibly do. Because it lowers the mass in cornering, so that's going to lower the roll moment, so you get less of a split. But on top of that, all of these points, you're lightening the car, right? The load on each tire decreases. They all shift up the curve towards a higher grip area. And so in the end, whereas the maximum potential grip before was 1.3, you actually have a potential grip of 1.37 now if you lighten the car by 800 kilograms, which is a lot, I admit. But let's say that you could. And then the roll moment also shrinks, and if you've also managed to reduce the center of gravity, now you're up to 1.3 Gs in actual grip around the turn. Now, most of you can't lighten your cars, but what you can do is adjust the front and rear axles and the stiffness of the springs and sway bars there to at least balance these roll moments. Because again, when you're cornering, the entire car is rolling over. And it's the stiffness of the front and rear springs that are going to stop it from rolling over, right? But those springs don't have to be the same stiffness. One can be stiffer than the other. So you can have a situation where if your car, for example, right, what have I got in this case? Let's say that your car is initially understeering and you want to promote oversteer, right? You can stiffen the rear springs or the rear sway bar, it has the same effect, and have more of that roll moment transfer to the rear. So now the rear axle is supporting the roll of the car sooner than the front axle because it has stiffer springs. What happens is the front axle load points move closer together and the rear axle ones move farther apart. Grip decreases on the stiffer axle and you can generate some oversteer if that's what you're looking to do. Similarly, if you can shift weight around, shifting weight to the rear axle tends to move all the points to the right towards a lower grip area. And again, you will tend to have less grip on the more heavily loaded axle. Now that you don't usually have a chance to adjust, but if you have a car like this where 60+% of its weight is on the front axle, which tends to generate understeer, what you will do is make a very stiff rear axle so that the rear axle tends to pick up more of the roll moment of the car to counteract the understeer that you have from the mass of the car being so heavily on the front axle. Okay? If you do that too much, you get into mid-corner oversteer, which is a dangerous situation. I'll show you one video from last year at Knox, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I was up waiting when this happened. This is someone in a radical getting into a little bit of mid-corner oversteer, I think. He was fine. No one was injured. But you can see what happens there, right? I mean, the rear end of the car slipped out middle of the corner. I don't know if he was trail braking or not, so it's hard to sort of say exactly what happens. But that's why, and I'll get back in a minute when I start talking about shocks, I like to dial in my car for a little bit of mid-corner understeer so that doesn't happen. Okay? It's a little more controllable to have a tiny bit of understeer in the middle of the corner when you're not on the brake, you're not on the gas, and the shocks have finished doing whatever thing they're doing. So I wrote up this summary. There's better versions of this on the internet that you can find. But roughly speaking, front mass tends to generate understeer. More of the mass on the rear tends to generate oversteer. You can counteract that with springs and sway bars. Stiffer front springs lead to understeer. Stiffer rear springs lead to oversteer, and vice versa. Right? You get better grip if you remove weight from the car because you're loading the rubber less. If you can't remove weight, the converse is to get wider tires, because the pressure on the rubber decreases as you make a bigger contact patch. So if people have a heavier car, it's not cornering that well, and most of us, this is the first thing we do, is just go to much wider tires, and you get better grip. And of course, lowering the center of gravity helps you increase grip as well. So I want to talk a little bit about a few other factors now impacting handling, impacting grip, and that's going to lead us a little bit into alignment, wheel alignment. So let me first give you a bit of a primer on wheel alignment for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about. There's three fundamental angles. There's camber, there's caster, and there's toe. Right? Negative camber, or camber, is the amount of lean at the top of the wheels into the car. So if I'm the car facing forward, then these are the wheels. This is camber. This is negative camber. If the wheels were leaning out, that's positive camber. Weirdly, the Jenny's Miata came stock with positive camber in the front, which we quickly eliminated. That's not the right way to have the wheels turn. Okay? Toe in is the wheels are pointing towards each other at the front of the axle. Toe out is pointing away from each other. Caster is a very poorly understood angle. It is the inclination of the kingpin with respect to the vertical. So the front wheels of your car can turn, right? So this only applies to the front axle. When a wheel turns, right, if this is your wheel and by steering you're going to turn it this way, what's the axis of rotation? It's not this. It's not straight up and down in a car. It's inclined. That angle, right, is the caster angle. So let's talk a little bit about camber. Camber, I think it's the one simple thing that we all fix on our cars if we're going to race them. Cars come from the factory with relatively little camber for two reasons usually. One is tire wear. If you have a lot of camber, you always wear out just the inside bit of your tires, which is frustrating if you're not a racer. Otherwise, you just get used to it and buy more tires. And the other reason, like the Miata, for example, came with very little, if not negative camber, if not positive camber, is for safety. Right? In that case, the car was a little bit tail happy to begin with, so I think the factory dialed in a little bit of positive camber in the front to make sure that if it got thrown hard into a turn, it wouldn't spin. As I said, we fixed that. Now, the reason negative camber is so effective is back to the squishiness of rubber, right? If you imagine a tire that's flat on the ground and you're asking it to provide force against the lateral motion, it's going to shear, right? It'll sort of bend and then squirt out from under the tire, and then the rubber will. But if you can lean the tire into the turn, you're pressing the rubber back into the tire, right? The force from the ground is actually pushing into the tire instead of just shearing the rubber off. It's what you do on a bicycle or a motorcycle anyways. You lean it into a turn, right? So it makes a lot of sense that camber would help you corner, and it does. And you can see Formula 1 cars carry maybe 4 degrees of negative camber. Your average road car is between 0 and minus half a degree. It's very little. So increasing that instantly improves cornering. You have to be careful that you do it on both axles, obviously, or adjust springs as necessary, at the expense of tire wear. And it is a little bit at the expense of braking and or power, right? Because again, the contact patch on the ground is getting smaller as you tilt the wheel. It's gonna cost you something, right? And usually you lose a little bit on braking or you lose a little bit of acceleration depending on which axle you increase the negative camber of. Now, the problem with that roll moment I was just describing, other than transferring load to the outside tires and making them less efficient, is it also decreases your outside camber angle. So you can actually see in this picture the two M3s, right? The race one that's been very stiffened in terms of suspension is not rolling over as much, and if you look at the outside front wheel, by eye, camber still looks okay. On my street car, which is stiffer than stock actually, but not that stiff, you can see we're getting into positive camber on this wheel. Because the camber angle is with respect to the car. If you tilt the entire car by 4 degrees, you lose your 4 degrees of camber. Okay? So despite what I was saying earlier about transferring roll moment to the front axle or rear axle, there is actually a situation where adding a sway bar, making, say, your front stiffer, could actually help grip there if it saves your camber angle from decreasing in a turn from the roll of the car. So this is where you can get a little bit of counterintuitive behavior. I've never had a car where that is actually the way it behaves, but I've been told that that could happen. So on to caster, which I think is the really poorly understood angle. There's 2 reasons you have caster, right? Well, one big fundamental reason, but there's a side effect, I suppose. Caster gives you steering feel. If you didn't have caster, when you went into a turn and turned the steering wheel, there would be no resistance. So if your front wheels were being steered against an axle that went straight through the contact patch, there's no restoring force. When you turn the wheel, you get cornering, right? It's not that it wouldn't corner, but you wouldn't feel that the car's cornering. There wouldn't, right now, if you turn the steering wheel of a car as you're driving, it takes some effort to turn a steering wheel. The harder you turn, the more effort you have to apply to the steering wheel. That effort comes from mechanical trail. It's a displacement, it's a moment arm between the axle of rotation, right? Steering rotation, not rolling rotation, but the axle of rotation of the front tire with respect to the contact patch to the ground. What that does is it makes a caster. It makes a caster like a shopping buggy, right? Where the wheel is touching the ground behind the rotation axis so that if this is rotation axis and I'm moving the car in this direction, the wheel sideways, the friction force on the wheel will tend to rotate the wheel back to be aligned with the direction of motion of the car. And you feel that in the steering wheel. That gives you the steering feel. Okay? So that's why there's caster. One might argue, well, should it be high? Should it be low? Right? And there's not a ton of opinion on that. Most people say maximize caster, which I tend to completely agree with, because maybe your steering gets a little bit harder, but if you have power steering, that shouldn't matter. But there's a secondary effect of caster, which is it increases camber when you're turning. And, hang on. Let me do this. So before that, I've jumped ahead of myself. The caster and that restoring force, if you increase your caster angle, you can have such a strong restoring force that if your car is getting out of shape, you can let go of the steering wheel and your front wheels will self-align with the direction of motion of the car. Right? So this is something we try to teach people when they're learning and say, if your car starts to get sideways, let go of the steering wheel. Right? Which is a little bit counterintuitive, but works really well. Just watch my hands on the wheel as it gets a little bit loose in the rain here. So right about here, it's oversteering, right? I just let the wheel slip through my hands, the wheels self-align with the direction of motion, and then you pick up the car again and keep going, right? If I hadn't done that, it would have been a spin, okay? So the other thing I wanted to say about caster, which helps immensely, is this. This is the only vehicle I could find with enough caster to actually show this effect visually, because the angles are usually not this large. But what it does is your caster angle gradually becomes camber angle as you turn the steering wheel. Now, I don't know if anyone here knows what the correct derivation is. Maybe don't tell me because I'll be embarrassed. But I couldn't find how much camber gain do you get per steering angle as a function of caster angle. So I went and re-derived it, and as far as I can make out, the camber gain is the arc sine of the product of the sine of the caster angle and the sine of the steering angle. If you do that in radians in the small angle approximation, you can completely simplify this and take in radians, not in degrees, okay? So, divide by pi and all that. But the product of your caster and steering angle becomes additional negative camber, okay? So if you have 4 degrees of caster, which is not unusual in a car, and you turn the front wheels by 10 degrees, you're gaining 7/10 of a degree of camber on the outside wheel, and the best part is your inside wheel is losing 7/10 of a degree of camber, because the inside wheel, of course, is cornering in the other direction. You don't want negative camber on the inside wheel. We're usually stuck with it, right? But if you can get the wheels turned like this in a car, that'd be ideal, right? So watch what you read. When I was setting up the Miata, there was a lot of stuff on the internet about how to set it up, and the front suspension lower control arms. People were suggesting maximizing the camber setting and minimizing the caster because it gives you a little bit more camber. And it's true, when the steering wheels, or when the front wheels are pointed forwards, so statically, right? Decreasing the caster angle gave you about 2/100ths of a degree more camber. It was a tiny little bit. But you lose a degree of caster, which means as soon as you've turned the wheels by 10 degrees, I calculated you lost 2/10ths of a degree of camber. Okay? So you've got to calculate this stuff for yourself. Don't necessarily believe what's on the internet. So in terms of alignment setup, again, I'm sure there's many people in the audience that could probably give a whole lecture on this better than I can. Maximizing caster, I just don't know any car where you can get too much caster, but maybe you have one, let me know. With mine, I've just maximized it. Eventually, the wheels rub on your wheel wells if you go too far, right? So, negative camber, I think Hoosier, for race star suggests something like 3 degrees, 4 degrees, right? So you kind of want to be in that range if you can get it. Not all cars are adjustable to that degree, or you may have to change some suspension components. Keeping in mind extra negative camber decreases braking grip in the rear axle, could decrease acceleration grip. Toe is a bit of a mystery. There's a lot of different opinions on toe. I'll tell you, rear toe out is bad. I don't know how many have experienced that. So imagine that your rear wheels are pointed this way, and you lean the car into a turn. As soon as the car starts to shift its weight onto the outside wheel, you lose all your rear end traction, right? Because the slip angle drops to near zero. If that happens under braking, it's extremely disconcerting. But it's basically losing traction and turn. So typical setups have positive rear toe in by some small amount. Gives you some stability and helps you negotiate that sort of power understeer, power oversteer curve. Okay? Front toe, some people toe out, some people toe in. There's different theories. A little bit of toe out at low grip can promote turn in. My view on front toe is once you're once you're mid-corner, it no longer matters, right? Because all your load is on the outside wheel, and you can adjust the angle of that. Unlike the rear axle, you can adjust the angle of the front wheels. So I tend to toe my cars in a little bit because I think if you could plot, and I haven't done this, but if you could plot a graph that was steering angle versus lateral acceleration, there's a curve. And the steepness of that curve near zero is going to depend on front toe. If your front tires are towed out, I'm not sure whether the curve is steep or shallow. If they're towed in, my argument is you're already developing a slip angle. The slip angle is already there. As you start to shift weight on a wheel that has some slip angle and that wheel starts to be more significant, you should be able to develop traction faster. Bottom line, you ultimately have to get out there and try these things out and measure, get some data logging, and figure out which setup works best for you. There's really, I can talk here all night, but it's not gonna help you until you actually go out and test this on your car. What I would say though is if you can, I would say maximize the alignment angles that give you the most grip on each axle, and then balance the car with springs and sway bars. Because if your car is tending to understeer, and you balance it by removing rear camber, you've sacrificed grip from your car, right? If that actually fixes the problem, you've just lost grip overall in the car, because now you're getting less rear grip because you had a little front grip. Just keep the camber, right, and stiffen the rear axle. Okay, and then you'll get more overall grip. Which brings us to springs. Now, again, this is a topic like I said, Formula SAE here would probably have a lot to say on this. I've asked myself a lot of questions around spring rates because I run pretty stiff springs. I actually don't run sway bars in my race car or my street car. I've just made up for it in springs. I just run stiffer springs. The reason I did that initially on the race car is because at Knox Mountain, weight matters more than anything, and the sway bars were heavy. So I just counteracted the sway bar spring rate by adding more regular spring rate and tossed 30 pounds of sway bars. In my street car, I don't have them because they broke. So I just, rather than buying you a sway bar, like they ripped out of the shocks. Anyways, I just had some extra springs lying around from the race car, and I just bumped up the spring rate. It handles great. But then you sort of ask yourself, well, wait, what's the right spring rate? Like, should it be 400 pounds an inch? Should it be 1,000 pounds an inch? Does it, what should it be for a 2,500 pound car or for a 3,000 pound car? And I found a website, by the way, called Optimum G. I don't know, maybe all of you know it. But anyways, there's some really, really nice documents on the website, and I've pulled a lot of this information from that website, as well as from Hypercoils, which is a spring manufacturer. Just quickly, there's a sprung mass and an unsprung mass, right? So there's your wheel that's rolling along the ground, and there's a spring, and then there's the sprung mass, which is the actual car, right? There's just the rough model. And there's a spring connecting these two, which is the spring that we're referring to. These are suspension springs. And of course, there's a shock also connecting those two. There is another spring, which is the tire itself bends. I'm not at all going to talk about that. This makes things substantially more complicated. But if you assume that the tire's on the ground and you're dealing with it as a simple harmonic oscillator, the sprung mass is floating up and down on the spring connected to the wheel. And there's a natural frequency to this, right? It's a harmonic oscillator. You can solve it and get the natural frequency of the sprung mass of your car bouncing up and down on the wheels. It goes as root k over m, right? Which is k is the spring constant and m is the mass of the car. If you know what frequency to start with, you can calculate a spring rate, right? So, okay, fine. So I looked, and Optimum G has this wonderful table of frequencies, ride frequencies, the weight of each corner of your car, and what spring rate you should pick. And they say for non-downforce cars, or cars that don't have wings pressing them into the ground, which create a whole other situation that most of us don't have to deal with, you should have a ride frequency of between 1.5 and 2.5 hertz for a sedan race car. That puts a spring rate for my car at around between 300 and 400 pounds per inch. I run 1,000 pounds per inch. Okay? And I've wondered what's going on here. Why is this so wrong? And then I realized, for us that are racing, if we don't care about comfort, which I hope you don't if you're racing, right? I mean, this whole natural frequency thing was developed for passenger cars. It is a transmissivity issue as far as I can tell, right? Basically, for a certain resonant frequency of your suspension, you can make a curve like this that says for frequencies below this point, if you have that perturbation coming into your wheel, it will transfer fully into the car. Above that frequency, it gets attenuated. And what I mean by that is if you drive over a speed bump, that's 1 meter long and it takes you a second to travel it. That's something like a 1 hertz frequency. For those of you that are in Eng Phys, this is what I mean by thinking in the frequency domain. Right? You do the Fourier transform with the speed bump, the natural frequency is 1 hertz. Right? At that frequency, that travels completely into the car. Right? And you know this. You drive slowly over a speed bump, the front of your car goes up, the front of your car goes down. Take the same speed bump at 100 kilometers an hour. Okay, well don't, 50. Okay? Right? Now that frequency is maybe 10 hertz. Maybe you travel over that speed bump in 1/10 of a second. And if you try this, it's really hard on your car, right? But the car doesn't actually bounce up and down as much as if you go over it slowly, right? It's hard on your shocks. Don't use this as a strategy to get over speed bumps. But it does give you this curve that says, okay, low frequency things are going to transfer into the car, high frequency things will not. So it makes for, it gets rid of the sort of washboard on the road, that sort of stuff transmitting into the car for people that care for comfort. Well, okay, but in a race car, the rate at which you're altering the roll of the car is also a natural frequency. And if you want to do things quickly in a race car, you're going to change its position in 100 millisecond. You could be dealing in frequencies in hertz that you're driving into the car through control of the steering wheel. And you don't want those to be absorbed by the suspension. You want them to transfer. In other words, when you flick the steering wheel, you'd like the car to respond immediately, not a few hundred milliseconds later. So I think that drives you towards higher spring frequencies. And that means stiffer springs, right? So again, so you might say, well, I'm running 1,000 pounds per inch. Why don't I run 2,000 pounds per inch? So the problem I see is less about the frequency, but about the fact that a plane is defined by 3 points, not 4. And ultimately, your wheels have to adapt to the surface that you're on, right? So if you have springs that are 1,000 pounds per inch and the surface rolls or has some unflatness in it on the order of an inch of height, you may well have a wheel completely off the ground even when the car's not moving, right? That's not going to help you distribute weight on the axles very well. So you have to think about, and this is what they do in racing, right? How bumpy is the road we're racing on? How bumpy is the surface we're racing on? If it's relatively flat, you can run relatively stiff springs. If it's really bumpy, you'd better run softer springs, or as you go over the bumps, your car will not be able to have as much grip, okay? So in other words, I'll tell you the reason I run stiff springs is not that I went through the stable and calculated the spring frequency, is I have 2 inches between the top of my tire and the top of the wheel well, okay? If I run 400 pounds per inch springs, my tires will keep hitting the wheel well or hitting the bump stop, and that really will not help. So higher spring stiffness, higher frequency gives you a faster response of the car. It also gives you less energy stored when you get the car unsettled. So if you roll the car into a turn, you're storing energy in the springs, or the stored potential energy of a spring is 1/2 kx squared. If you stiffen the springs, k goes up. Say you double k, x goes down by a factor of 2, but x is squared. So stiffer springs store less energy. It also allows you to run a lower ride height like I do. So I've gone to very stiff springs to get a lower center of gravity for the reasons described earlier. Now, my car is going to get easily unsettled on bumps. Thankfully, I mostly drive relatively smooth circuits. You're going to ask a lot more of your shocks to be able to damp springs that are very stiff. And of course, you better match any sway bars or shocks appropriately to make it work right. I do want to show you, because this is interesting. I had a chance. Obviously, this is a Knox. This is my M3. When I took this video, it wasn't fully chopped up yet. It weighed 2,600 pounds, 900 pounds per inch springs. And I had a little bit of an oversteer moment coming out of 2B. Right? No drama. I just turned into the bit of oversteer, and it was fine, right? Same situation on a Ferrari F40. It weighed exactly the same and had half the spring rate. Whoa. That's the owner in the passenger seat. He was delighted. He actually let me go out again after, he has a lot of trust, I don't know why. So, yeah, it behaved really weird. It just stored a lot of energy in the springs, and partly the mass of the car is heavily on the rear wheels in that car. Made it very hard to handle under braking and under cornering, to be honest. So in fact, if you look at Ferrari, and I drove the 430, I drove the 458, and then this year I drove the 488, they doubled their spring rate. They went from 13 kilograms per millimeter to 26 kilograms per millimeter. Now, I don't have their exact angles and linkage setups calculating the motion ratios, but my estimate is they're now running about 900 pounds per inch, which gives them a natural frequency of 4 hertz, which Optimum G and conventional wisdom would say is reserved for downforce cars. And this is not a downforce car. It's a 3,000 pound car, right? So maybe it'll generate a couple hundred pounds of downforce, but not enough to push the chassis into the ground. So anyways, that's my thoughts on springs. I'm sticking to stiffer springs, but I would love to hear counter arguments against it. And then comes shocks, okay? Shocks are a very important part of the suspension. They do 2 things. One is they absorb energy that gets stored in the spring. So back to the energy sloshing back and forth and sort of causing you problems beyond whatever you've just corrected. Again, this is the reason shocks were placed in cars. They were a comfort thing, right? So when you go over a bump, you don't bounce down the road for the next 10 seconds up and down, just your springs compressing, uncompressing, which is what would happen. You have a harmonic oscillator. If you don't dampen it, it'll just keep oscillating. That function for us is important but less critical. What's important for us as racers is we can adjust the transient handling of the car with shocks. Right? So let me first talk about damping and energy absorption. This is again from Optimum G. It's a nice graph of the distance between the top of the car and the center of the wheel after you've gone over a bump. Right? So you've hit a bump, there's some disturbance, the front of the car gets thrown up, and then it starts to bounce, right, and settle down. So if your shocks are very weak, it would be on the blue line, so you bounce a few times and eventually settle. Road cars tend to be set up on the green or red line, so there's one short bounce and then it kind of settles down. And I'm setting up my race car to be on the blue line. Okay, so it's sort of, there's no overshoot, it just settles a little bit slowly if necessary. And we'll see, somewhere between the blue and red is probably the right solution. And that will increase transmissivity at high frequencies, right? So if with hard shock, you know this from experience, if with hard shocks you go over a small bump, you'll feel it, right? But your car will also respond faster in cornering. And all that weight transfer during a launch, if you have stiffer compression shocks, that weight transfer happens earlier. Weight transfer for trail braking under brush braking happens earlier if you have stiffer shocks. Your car just responds faster. You can transfer weight, you can transfer forces into your wheels a lot faster with stiffer shocks. The other thing, of course, that shocks let you do, if you have, those of you that have adjustable shocks on your cars, is you can change the stiffness of the shocks front and rear to change the handling of the car in those transition moments at the entry of a turn and at the exit of a turn. So what at least, and again, everyone may have their own different driving styles and setups. What I like to do is set up my car to be understeering a little bit in a neutral setting, no gas, no brake, and the car has settled into the turn, so the shocks have finished moving, and to set up the shocks for slight oversteer. So when I'm coming into a turn and I flick the car into the turn, the balance of the car will tend towards oversteer, will tend to rotate it in, but as the shocks stop moving, right, they finish compressing, their force goes away and the balance of the car shifts to understeer. So you can set up cars by using shocks and springs separately to give you transit behavior like this that can help you drive the way you'd like to drive the car. Yes, I know that. Thank you. And finally, I've just gone through this calculation with the Miata, and I've gone through it with my race car. People put bits on their car, they take bits off their car, and at some point you've got to ask yourself, is anything useful actually happening here? Right? And should I buy this sway bar or this sway bar? You have to do the calculations. It can save you a lot of money and time. There's calculators out there. This is one from GT Spark Plugs that allow you to put in the dimensions of a sway bar, and it gives you the stiffness of the sway bar. And you've got to ask yourself, either measure or calculate, but ask yourself, what's the rate of my sway bar spring rate compared to the suspension spring rates? Is it equal? Is it 10%? Is it 1,000%? So just buying a sway bar a front sway bar for Jenny's car, which is the only sway bar I'm allowed to buy for the car to stay in E-stock class, right? The sway bar that everyone buys for the Miata is actually a really stiff sway bar, and I calculated the stiffness at the wheel of that sway bar compared to the springs in the car, which I'm not allowed to change, because if it's going to stay stock, I can't change them. And that sway bar spring rate was greater than the spring rate that's in the car from the suspension springs. And since I can't change the rear sway bars or the rear springs, right, that was a really nice sway bar. It was tubular, it was very light, right? I had to go for a heavier sway bar, right, that was less powerful, because otherwise we would have been understeering all the time. And sure enough, it actually turned out to be, I think, a pretty good balance. At the same time, if you stiffen your front swings but don't change your sway bar, you can have a sway bar whose spring rate is 1% of your spring rate for your suspension springs, in which case it probably is not doing anything except adding weight to your car. Okay? So it's worth making those calculations, asking that, measuring for your shocks. What's a shock force? right? When you compress your springs, if you calculate the velocity with which your spring compress in a turn, how much force is your shock providing? The reason I'm using 10% as a benchmark here is because if I make a change of 10% front rear to my springs, it changes the handling of the car enough, like it's significant. Anything less than that, I probably couldn't notice much. So I actually went through it. I was lucky I have the technical manual for the Ferrari 488, and because it runs the same spring rates I do and it's roughly the same weight, I went through it and actually looked at its shock rates and calculated to mine. And I did it this way. I don't have a shock dyno. So I hung my shocks from the ceiling and then added like a 50-pound mass, a 100-pound mass, and a 200-pound mass. And so how long does it take for the shocks to come down, which in my case was a car battery, Steph, and me, roughly. Okay. And then you time it, and you say, okay, that took 2 seconds, that took 7 seconds. And it turns out my race car was hugely underdamped, which Mark Ullman noticed at Knox. He saw me go over a bump and said, your car kept bouncing. And he was exactly right. Again, on the same note, just think about the geometry, do some measurements. I've seen some sway bar linkage mechanisms that are terrifying, right? So again, the sway bar, now this is only the racers will really know if you've had your car part. You've got your control arm and cross section here. There's the end link to the sway bar. And you buy these aftermarket sway bars and they have a bunch of holes in them to help you go from soft to hard, right? Because it changes the length of the moment arm, right? So of course that changes the stiffness. But the inclination of your end link in some of those setups is really frightening. If the end link starts to be really tilted, it's a force multiplier. The sway bar will do what it says it's going to do. It'll be stiff if you put it in the hole closer to the rotation point of the bushing. But instead of the force from your suspension being driven upwards to rotate the control arm of the sway bar, it's going to be largely compressing the bushings. A lot of the force gets driven into the bushing of the sway bar, and your sway bar may still work, but now you'd better have really stiff bushings. Okay? So think about that a little bit. It's better to maybe, you may not have a choice, but maybe that means trading up to urethane bushings or something like that. So final summary, watch what you read on the internet. I've seen a lot of things that are wrong. There is no substitute for getting out there and tuning your car. And if I can make a plug to the UBC Sports Car Club, what we really need is a day where instead of autocrossing, we go out and we each get X number of laps. It's test and tune, basically. But having more days like that where we can go out and adjust camber, do a lap, adjust camber, do a lap, adjust your toe in, do a lap, and just watch your times and have data logging equipment on site that we can use to measure what we've done. And I will leave you now with inspiration for your future driving skills. As I was looking around on the internet and to find cool race videos, I found this one which shows some of the craziest level of control and self-confidence in a car I've ever seen. I don't know how you, at that speed, you get sideways in a car and then steer through a metal cattle grid without hitting the sides with a flat left front tire, as it turns out at that point, because he broke his tire. And with that, thank you very much.